Good evening, and welcome to Guelph Museum's Military Lecture Series. My name is Ken Irvin, and I'm the Education Coordinator at Guelph Museums. And I'd also like to thank tonight the Laurier Center for Military and Strategic Disarmament Studies for their partnership in this series. Tonight's talk by Dr. Roger Sarty will be about 45 minutes in length, with time at the end for Roger to answer some questions. To ask a question, since we have a new platform, this way you simply go to the question and answer part on the menu. And this menu can be found at the top right of your screen by clicking the speech bubble icon. And to ask a question in the question and answer feature, select Ask a Question. Type in your name or select Post as anonymous, and then type in your question and select Send. We will see your question and it will be answered during the question and answer period at the end of Roger's talk. If you have any problems viewing the presentation tonight, please know that this is being recorded and will be made available on Guelph Museum's social media platforms. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that Guelph is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples, specifically the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Through the Between the Lakes Purchase No. 3 Treaty of 1792, the Mississaugas of the Credit ceded to the British Crown over 3 million acres of land between Lakes Huron, Ontario, and Erie. Today, Guelph is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Guelph Museums commits to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and we must do more to learn, share, and support truth and healing. Guelph Museums continues to build our knowledge and relationships about the land, its history, and its peoples. This commitment informs all that we do at Guelph Museums. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Roger Sarty has been a member of the History Department at Wilfrid Laurier University since 2004. He's a graduate of Duke University and the University of Toronto. He was a historian at the Department of National Defence and then head of exhibitions and historical research and deputy director at the Canadian War Museum between 1998 and 2003. Roger is a native of Halifax who grew up hearing stories of the Halifax Explosion from his great-grandfather, Dr. John Bell, MD, who is, I guess, one of the first responders. The book Catastrophe is the 11th book on the military history of Atlantic Canada that Roger has authored, co-authored, or edited. And this is Roger's third time speaking with our lecture series. And it's great to have him back, and hopefully this will not be your last talk. I'm going to turn it over to you, Roger, and I'm really looking forward to your talk tonight. So thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks very, very much, Ken. It's always a pleasure. I wish we were in person because the Guelph crowds are always so very, very special. Yeah, as Ken mentioned, this is based on an interesting book project I undertook for the Wilfrid Laurier University Press. And it's an interesting background to the book, which I'll go into a little bit. Now, just to help set the scene, this all takes place in Halifax, and which is significant because Halifax, which you can see here in the center of the Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia, is the mainland all-season port in North America that is closest to Europe. Now, Nova Scotians will say, well, Sydney is almost as big and it's in Nova Scotia. Yes, but it's, at least in the First World War, it was an island, so it's not part of mainland North America. But this is absolutely crucial because as the background, in the First World War, as the Germans more and more effectively attacked Allied merchant shipping, we'll talk more about that later, Britain and France both became more and more dependent on supplies from North America. And that's both Canada and the United States in the last 2 years of the war, 1917 and 1918. And for various reasons that we'll go into later, everything had to be shipped out through well-defended ports. And two of the key ports for the shipment of supplies to Europe were Halifax, which was by far the more important port, and Sydney. The other two big ones were New York and the Hampton Roads in Virginia. Now here's a modern day view of Halifax for those who don't know it. This is looking south out towards the Atlantic Ocean. The big green, beautiful island stretching out at the end of your screen, that is McNabb's Island, absolutely gorgeous island. And then closer into the city, you can see is George's Island. Interesting comment, the only reason, or I think the only reason, both these islands are in their spectacular natural state is they were both vital for the fortification of the city. And so they were military reserves and therefore protected against development. The military, in fact, was in charge of both islands until the 1960s. And since then, there's been enough of a conservation movement that the islands have been protected. In the foreground, of course, is another important military reserve in Halifax, the Halifax Citadel. Now here is looking north. We're almost over the Citadel here, but looking back in the other direction. And in the foreground, you see the original Cross Harbour Bridge between Halifax and Dartmouth, the Angus L. MacDonald Bridge that opened in 1954. And then in the distance is the Mackay Bridge, or Mackay Bridge, which was opened, I believe, in the mid-1970s. And the explosion took place on the Halifax shore, that's on the left-hand side of the screen, about halfway between the MacDonald Bridge and the Mackay Bridge. So you can see the area where it took place. Up the big expanse of water at the top of the screen is Bedford Basin, which is a natural basin about, it must be 50 square kilometers of deep water. And this is where, when in both World Wars, shipping, because of the German submarine threat, had to be sailed in convoys, in groups. The convoys, 50 and 60 ships, would gather in Bedford Basin and then sail out through the Narrows under what is now the Mackay Bridge, out under the MacDonald Bridge, and then out to sea. Here's what Halifax looked like in the First World War. And a key theme in the book, and I think absolutely essential to understanding anything about the Halifax explosion, was its First World War context. And Halifax was the largest and most important military and naval port in Canada. And here you have the layout, actually quite impressive fortifications. I remember the Atlantic Ocean is down at the bottom of the screen, and just in from there, you see Fort McNabb and Sandwich Battery. We have a picture of one of those. These had enormous 9.2-inch guns that could shoot up to about 15 kilometers out to sea. They closed the outer harbor. Within the harbor are numerous other batteries with light, quick-firing guns. I'll show you some pictures in a moment. And then specially installed because of the submarine threat in the First World War were 2 anti-submarine nets that are indicated there. Some of the action we'll discuss today, the actual explosion, as you'll see, is way back beyond or north of the fortifications and north of Citadel Hill. Just close to what you see up there is HMC Dockyard, which is the naval dockyard, and the Wellington Barracks, which was one of the main barracks areas in the city, and were actually the 2 military installations most badly devastated by the explosion. Now here is I'm sorry, this map is in a wrong orientation. If we were to do it proper with the north to the top, we would swing the left-hand side of the map right up to the top. But the story is, and this is why the First World War context is so important, is 2 ships collided in the port, and both ships were in Halifax only because of the First World War and Halifax's role as one of the main supply ports for the Allied forces in Europe. And the 2 ships involved were the Norwegian ship Emo, which you'll see up there in the top center screen, pardon me, and the French freighter Mont-Blanc, also on the top center screen. Mont-Blanc was under the control of the French government to carry explosives. And Mont-Blanc had loaded in New York, was supposed to go in a convoy from New York to carry the explosives, over 3,000 tons of high explosives. She was supposed to carry these explosives in a convoy from New York, but she was too slow for the New York convoys. New York ran the faster convoys. the slow convoys sailed from Virginia in the south and Halifax and Sydney in the north. Now, Sydney was closed for the winter. So the New York shipping authorities, who were British, the British naval staffs in the American ports actually ran the convoys, sent Mont-Blanc up to Halifax and said, they're organizing slow convoys there. You can get into a slow convoy. So Mont-Blanc was coming in only to join a slow convoy. And in order to protect the port against attack, quite ironically, there was an examination anchorage outside of the port. You see it marked there in about center screen. It was under the protection of Fort McNabb, one of the most powerful forts with powerful searchlights. And the anti-submarine nets were closed at night. No shipping was allowed into the port at night for security reasons. If anything came in by night, the searchlights would be turned on and the batteries would engage, because an attack on a port, in fact, was most likely to come at night with high speed, either submarines running fast on the surface or motor torpedo boats. And so any ship that arrived after about 5 p.m., or actually after about 4 p.m., in the winter months, when it got dark early, would be held in the examination anchorage off of Fort McNabb. So that's where Mont-Blanc, she arrived on our long haul from New York after in the early evening of the 5th of December. And so she was held in the examination anchorage overnight, and then she began to sail up the port at about sometime before 8 o'clock in the morning. Meanwhile, the Emo, which was a Norwegian ship, she was, in fact, the Norwegians were neutral, and Emo had been taken up under charter by the American-Belgian Relief Fund in order to carry food supplies into Belgium. The Belgians were starving. Most of Belgium was under German occupation. And in a rare humanitarian gesture of sensibility, the Allies offered to feed the Belgian population, and the Germans agreed to allow it to happen so the burden wouldn't fall on the Germans. And the ships that carried the supplies, mainly from United States and Canada, were commissioned under the Belgian Relief Agency, and they carried big signs on their side. We'll see one on Emo shortly saying Belgian Relief, so that German submarines would not attack them. Now, Emo had also, Emo had to come into Halifax because, as a security regulation, because of the intense German measures against Allied shipping, all neutral ships, all ships that had stopped in Europe, had to come into a British-controlled port for security clearance before they proceeded any farther. This was because there was a great fear of saboteurs putting high explosives into the ships. This is rather ironic in light of the fact that Halifax was blown up by high explosives, but not by saboteurs, but our own explosives in one of our own ships. But at any rate, Emo had to sail into Halifax to be searched in Bedford Basin by a top-flight Royal Navy security crew. She was held, virtually as a prisoner ship in Bedford Basin until she was cleared. And unfortunately, she wasn't cleared until too late on the 5th. Actually, her coal was slow in arriving. So she finished too late on the 5th to sail. And so just when Mont-Blanc is trundling in from the examination anchorage in the south, Emo is getting underway from Bedford Basin in the north. And they're both there purely because Halifax is such an important shipping port. What happens then is Emo is coming out, and she runs into trouble. Well, not into trouble, but there is the gates have just opened, so there's a lot of shipping coming into the port, and the American ship SS Clara is coming fairly quickly into Bedford Basin on the Halifax side. So Emo, which normally would have gone out on the Halifax side of the channel, goes over into the center channel. And though it's not shown here, just after Emo goes by, out comes a big tugboat, the Stella Maris, pulling a big line of barges, and she completely blocks the access to the Halifax channel. So Emo stays over towards the Dartmouth side of the channel. And then this is where everything goes wrong. Mont-Blanc is coming down, and what's explained in our book, and the author, Joe Scanlon, actually put this story together very well, is as you'll notice there's a pronounced bend in the channel. And at this time in the morning, the sun would be shining right into the eyes of the crew on Emo. So the visibility isn't good, and they're coming around a corner. And it looks like what happened is the two ships meet or first sight each other when they're only about 2 kilometers apart, which is virtually that circle showing the later blast explosion. That's virtually the line where the two ships could see each other. They only had about 7 minutes to react. And Emo knew that she was on the wrong side of the channel, but she saw that the Mont-Blanc was coming along and was well out into the channel, thought it would be okay. So Emo carries along the Dartmouth shore, though that was the wrong side for her in theory. And Mont-Blanc comes along and then sees Emo. And then both ships take evasive actions, unfortunately, in the same direction. And there is just a gentle collision, and the bow of the bigger ship, the Emo, goes a few feet into the side of Mont-Blanc. But Mont-Blanc is absolutely filled with high explosive powder. And some of this powder catches fire. And then Mont-Blanc drifts for about 20 minutes. The collision is about 8:45 in the morning, as you can see there. And the Mont-Blanc drifts down into the Halifax shore into Pier 6, as you can see. Tragically, here's the burning ship. It's a lovely day, and word goes out in the city. There's a burning ship in the harbor. Everybody's fascinated and goes running out to watch. And in fact, from the naval dockyard, a pinnace goes out from HMCS Niobi, Canada's only naval warship, which you can see there on the naval dockyard. And the pinnace goes out to help Mont-Blanc, and the pinnace is just arriving there, and Mont-Blanc blows up a few minutes after 9 in the morning with devastating force. All 3,000 plus tons of high explosives go up in a flash. And here are the results mapped out. This is from the book. And you can see the dark area is the area of total devastation. And we'll see some pictures of this shortly. What was awful is this was the northern end of the city. It was all wooden. Halifax is famous as a wooden city. So the explosion blew down all of the houses and businesses. But because it was winter, and even though it was a fairly warm winter day, an unseasonably warm winter day, everybody's coal furnaces were on. So all of the buildings are blown down, and then they catch fire. And a huge blaze begins to burn all through the north end. And it continues it doesn't begin to die down until after about 3.5 or 4 hours. If there's a happy side of the story, it's that the Citadel Hill, and remember that picture, the dramatic Citadel Fortress that you saw, is on a 250-foot hill. And that hill protects the south end of the city, deflects the blast off. And so the south end of the city, which is the seat of government and the main military headquarters, although they're badly damaged, no one is killed. And the senior commanders and the city fathers, the municipal authorities, are, if injured, only slightly, which is, I guess, about the only part of the good news in the story. And this is, remember from this is crucial, actually parked in the center of the channel were 2 British escort vessels. You'll see them towards the right-hand side of the screen. The HMS Highflyer, which was a very powerful cruiser, and about 500 feet long with about 500 crew on board, Royal Navy cruiser. She escorted convoys across the ocean. And also the HMS Shangwinola, which is an odd name. She was in fact a fast merchant ship that had been converted into a convoy escort ship. She had a crew of about 300. Both these ships suffered quite serious damage, but only superficial damage. The worst was on High Flyer. About 13 of her crew who were on deck were killed, which were the heaviest naval losses. But it was the personnel on those ships that played an absolutely critical role, along with the Canadian Army, in the first emergency response. And here's a photograph taken by a Royal Navy sailor, probably from the High Flyer, and this is of the this is after the explosion, and this is the famous cloud settling down. Here is what the north end of the city. Here we're looking down towards Bedford Basin. Bedford Basin is just out of sight at the far end, and in the foreground are the main railway yards and the Canadian Naval Dockyard. This is in the 1890s. The top picture is roughly the same scene as it looked a day after the explosion. And you'll note all the snow, as if the bad luck couldn't be bad enough. After the explosion, the day after the explosion, an enormous blizzard roared through and helped hinder the arrival of outside assistance. In the foreground here, you can particularly see what happened in the north end with all of the wooden buildings being blown down and then completely burned out in the fire. It looks like, with all the tabulations over the years, it looks like there was something over 1,900 people killed or died of injuries in the explosion, and there is something like 10,000 people injured. And these are casualty rates that are the equivalent of the worst days of the First World War on the Western Front for the Canadian Army Corps. But the Canadian Army Corps had 100 to 150,000 people. Halifax had only 55,000 people. So out of 55,000 people, about 12,000 were killed or injured. It was absolutely devastating. It was the equivalent of having a major First World War battle on Canadian soil. Here is the Emo. She was blown right up on the Dartmouth shore, and if you look on her side, you can still see the sign Belgian Relief there as a warning to German submariners. Then, as now, the international language of transportation was in English, which is why it's spelled out in English, Belgian Relief, for the benefit of German submariners. Now, the manuscript that I got to edit was written by Joseph Scanlon, and he's on the left-hand side of the screen, signing a piece of paper. He was a renowned Canadian journalist, and matter of fact, he was, I think, chief of the Washington bureau for the Toronto Star in the early 60s. He later went to help found the School of Journalism at Carleton, and he became an expert in disaster. He came at it from a media angle. He became fascinated by disaster reporting and actually worked with Emergency Measures Canada to work out media plans for handling current day disasters. And he did intensive studies of a 9/11 in New York, the tsunami in Japan, the tsunami in Australia. Expert on current day disasters. But he became fascinated in the late 1980s with the Halifax Explosion and spent about 10 years doing research. He visited a lot of people who were, it was when he was doing his research that the last survivors were still alive, and he was able to interview a fair number of them. And he was a fanatical journalist. He went to all the small towns all around Halifax and went into their fire department records and their police department records. He went to all the local railway stations, some of whom had records of the explosion, as well as going into the National Archives of Canada, of France, and into the shipping archives of Norway, all of the countries involved in the explosion. And he published a number of papers on the explosion, but he never published his big book. And then he died suddenly in 2013, and his children discovered the manuscript on his computer. And his oldest son, David Scanlon, assembled the manuscript. David Scanlon, as it turns out, was a naval information officer. He was a captain in the Navy. That's quite senior, the equivalent of full colonel in the Army, and he was a senior officer for public information. Oh, he served with NATO in various of the hot spots in the 1980s and the 1990s, senior positions at NDHQ. One great result of his being such an expert information officer, he was a brilliant editor, and he started on the work of cleaning up the manuscript. The manuscript was still, in some respects, quite rough. And David passed the manuscript around to various university presses. Laurier was interested, and they sent it out to anonymous reviewers. I guess I can reveal now I was one of the anonymous reviewers. And I said, yes, I think we can do something with this. And I wrote a few pages on what needed to be done, which is probably not a smart thing to do, because the press then came back and said, your views are in line with the views of other anonymous readers. And all of them recommended that if they wanted somebody to clean it up, it should be you. So I got stuck with the job. No, it was a labor of love. As I say, I grew up on stories of the Halifax Explosion. Here is just a little bit of interesting context. One of the central points in the book, or the real thesis of the book, is that Halifax was very much like 9/11 and many other current day disasters. In that, and Scanlon, I should say, he's very prominent in disaster research circles in the United States. His papers have gone to the University of Delaware, where there's a large disaster research center. We've had calls from U.S. universities interested in disaster from all across that country. He's a very big name and had excellent access, and he worked with many top flight specialists, sociologists and medical researchers and military researchers, police researchers. And what he discovered in modern day disasters was that in the face of a disaster, people at ground zero almost always do the right thing, and we'd call it heroic, but they're doing the right thing. And they respond almost instinctively, doing what needs to be done, looking after the injured, getting food and water, whatever needs to be done. And we saw that in 9/11, for example, where the civilian ferry service immediately became, an emergency evacuation service for the casualties and bringing in emergency supplies. And he discovered that despite contrary stories, this was the case in Halifax, and that not only had the people at ground zero done very, very well, but that the armed forces in the city, and that is the nearly 5,000 troops who are in Halifax, Army troops in Halifax, either as garrisons for the fortifications, and I have pictures here. Here are some of the quick-fire guns on McNabb's Island and below. Actually, this is from Britain, but it's a searchlight exactly of the sort mounted at Halifax in large numbers to light up the harbour at night. Halifax was exactly like one of the big defended ports in France or in England. Halifax was that very, very important. But what Scanlon discovered was that the military and the naval forces on the ground did wonderful work, as did the municipal government, as did the railways. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And in part because of the explosion, and then because of the awful blizzard, the first help doesn't get in, significant help, from outside of the Maritimes. It doesn't come in from central Canada or from New England until 48 hours after the disaster. And what happened, this is argued in the book and laid out in some detail, is the outsiders came in and are absolutely horrified at what they see. They think, it's like hell on earth. And the outsiders believe they have saved the day, that they have come into a disaster and they have brought order out of chaos. But there's a problem with that. In fact, things were infinitely worse 48 hours earlier. And they don't appreciate just how appalling it was. And the people who come in from outside almost blame the first responders for not doing more faster. And that aside, a lot of the outsiders, of course, are coming from agencies, be they government or not-for-profits, who are trying to establish their names with taxpayers or with funders. And so they tend to, the people coming from outside, they usually come with the press corps, which is what happened in Halifax. And so the story gets out. Here's this poor little maritime city, caught in total disaster. And then the people came from Montreal and Boston and New York, and they come roaring in to the rescue. And Joe argues in some detail this is exactly what happened in Japan with the tsunami, which has happened in New York. As the big federal agencies move in, they announce they have saved the day. And in many ways, this book is to pay tribute to the first responders in Halifax. Here's mentioned the military garrison was very important. Those guns shown above, this is an aerial view taken in 1919, some of the first aerial photographs taken in Canada of that magnificent fortification. And you can see all of the barracks. It's a most interesting site, still exists today. The troops, the 3,000 local troops, are militia from Nova Scotia. These are just part-time soldiers who've been called out for full-time duty. A lot of them wanted to go overseas, but they weren't allowed to because Halifax was such a vital port that they needed efficient defenses. Through the war, more and more of them are allowed to go overseas. And by 1917, a lot of the guys in the garrison are, in fact, people who were medical categories that were too low for overseas service, or who have come back from overseas. And because of health problems or injuries, they have been approved medically only for garrison duty. And so a lot of these, although a lot of these soldiers were not in great shape, they behaved very, very heroically indeed. This shot is taken from Ives Point Battery at McNabbs Island in one of the buildings in the same fort we looked at before. Here out towards the harbor mouth is one of the enormous 9.2-inch guns. This is like a gun on a heavy cruiser, and there were 3 of them mounted out towards the mouth of Halifax Harbor as a defense against long-range cruisers or battleships. Now here, much of the credit for the good first response goes to the military garrison. And, everybody says Canada didn't have much of a peacetime army. How was it that we had such an excellent garrison on Canadian soil? Well, in fact, the story of Halifax is, at least for a Haligonian, is an interesting one. And that is Halifax, right from its early days, was an important British Army base, initially because of the guerrilla warfare with the First Nations and the French in the 18th century in Nova Scotia. And then later, when the United States became a major threat to Canada, and Halifax became the main bastion for defense against the United States. So there is a large British garrison and a complex set of fortifications which are constantly updated, and they are not taken over by Canada until 1906. And in 1906, Canada takes over the Halifax garrison because the British are anxious to concentrate their armed forces closer to home because of the potential for a crisis in Europe, which of course later came to fruition. So Canada had always had only a tiny regular army, only 1,000 people. But in 1906, we greatly expand that army to over 3,000 people, many of them expert British people who've taken an offer to come over to the Canadian Regular Army and to train our people. And more than is appreciated, Halifax in 1906 really becomes the center for the development of the Canadian Army. And Canada, believe it or not, although we're very irresponsible in defense, we do fulfill our commitment to Britain and maintain a full professional garrison of over 1,000 troops in Halifax. And we fully maintain mobilization plans to organize the local militia, which is why Halifax is always on a very efficient basis. The commander in Halifax is also the commander in the whole maritime provinces. He's the guy in the center with the beautiful dog. This is Major General Thomas Benson. And behind him is his staff. This is the staff as it's known in 1917 as Military District 6, which is Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. New Brunswick is Military District 7. Down there to the right is, now I mentioned General Benson because he instantly connected with the municipal authorities. It turned out Canadian and even British defense planning was flawed because there wasn't formal, strong links between the military authorities in defended cities and the civilian authorities. But Benson had immediately locked arms with the municipal government within hours of the disaster and cooperated. He put all of the military resources at the disposal of municipal authorities. And more than that, Benson was really the senior guy. And the top British and Canadian sailors in port came to Benson, and Benson then helped organize the very large naval contingents that came ashore. So Benson was a hero. Another hero is over to the right, and this is Dr. Frederick McKelvey Bell, who was an Ottawa doctor, I guess quite a renowned physician, who had joined the pre-war militia and come out in active service in 1914, had gone overseas and helped organize one of the first big Canadian field hospitals in France. Then he was brought back to Canada and he must have been good. He was brought back to Canada to help organize the medical services in all of Canada. And then the fortunate thing for Halifax was that in early 1917, he is transferred to Halifax as the senior medical officer on General Benson's staff. Why is he sent? And that's because in 1917, masses of injured troops are coming back from England. Not just injured troops, but sick troops are coming back from England. And Halifax is the main secure port for the shipment of troops overseas and for the return of troops. And by 1917, it's quite clear the Canadian government is completely messing up efforts to look after these injured and ill-returned men. And so the government sets on a more formal organization, a system of government hospitals, and sets up a medical system to receive these people. And McKelvey Bell, I'm pretty sure, is sent to Halifax in order to greatly expand the hospital system in Halifax. There is excellent Garrison military hospital facilities, but they open a couple of huge new hospitals in order to receive wounded men from overseas. And McKelvey Bell is the hero because he instantly does close liaison with all of the civilian hospitals, and he effectively combines the civilian and military hospital facilities, works with the railways to actually evacuate injured guys from the military hospitals in Halifax to emergency hospitals set up in Truro and Glasgow on the interior in order to open up those hospitals for the injured from the explosion. So he does an extraordinary effort. And matter of fact, one of the reasons that Joe Scanlon got so fascinated by the Halifax story, and Bell in particular, is he said Bell's reports on how to handle mass casualties would still be valuable in a textbook today in how to respond to a disaster. So Bell and Benson are two of the heroes. I mentioned the Navy. The Canadian Navy is in an odd position. The Navy barely existed in 1914 because of disputes in Canadian politics about whether there should be a Navy. Canada just had two older British cruisers that we had bought as training ships for modern ships that were to be built in Canada. The Conservative government of Robert Borden in 1911 cancels that whole program. And we enter the war with just those two old cruisers, which get to sea, but come under British command. The British immediately, at the outbreak of war, send squadrons back into the Eastern Pacific and the Western Atlantic. And on the East Coast, HMCS Niobi, our East Coast cruiser, joins the Royal Navy squadron that's operating out of Halifax again. And Rainbow on the West Coast joins the Royal Navy squadron that's operating out of Esquimalt, British Columbia. But when the Germans turned to submarine warfare in 1915, it becomes obvious that cruisers are nearly useless for trade protection in the Atlantic, because cruisers are big, they're not too maneuverable, they're very vulnerable to submarine attack. And the British can offer no help to protect Canada's coasts against this unexpected submarine attack, so we have to do it ourselves. So we lay up Niobi as a floating barracks. It's really a floating augmentation to the dockyard, and we train hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of young seamen here in schools established in Niobi. She's now a floating barracks, in order to crew small anti-submarine vessels that we built to patrol off of Canada's east coast. The German submarine threat becomes its worst in early 1917, and this shows just in the opening months of 1917 the many ships that are sunk in British waters. The British are so desperate, that's when they begin to organize convoys for the first time, which proved to be a magical solution to the submarine threat. Submarines, if you're sailing your merchant ships individually, submarines can hunt them down like ducks in a barrel. If you group the ships together in defended convoys, the submarines don't dare approach. And Halifax becomes a key submarine port. The top photograph is a rare photograph of merchant ships in dazzle camouflage sailing out Halifax Harbor to form up in a convoy. And below were some of the small trawlers that we built in the Canadian shipyards. In order to, these trawlers carried anti-submarine listening gear and depth charges, and they sailed out with the convoys to protect the convoys during their first day or two of passage. Now, the convoy organization in Halifax is run by the British Admiralty. As I said, the British run all of the transportation in the Atlantic in 1917 and 1918. And here we have Rear Admiral Bertram Chambers, who is a very experienced professional British naval officer who actually had training in organizing convoys in the UK. He comes over as soon as convoys start in early 1917 in Sydney and Halifax. He comes over to organize those convoys. He mainly uses Canadian staff. On the right is Walter Hose. Now, the commander of the port in Halifax, the Canadian commander, is quite badly injured in the explosion. Hose is the commander of the anti-submarine patrol fleet. So Hose steps in and becomes commander. Now, there are some accounts that say that the Navy was useless. The Canadian Navy was useless in the explosion. Not so. We reviewed in detail Admiral Chambers' reports, and they show an absolutely fascinating story, and that is the dockyard was very, very close to the explosion. Many of the buildings were flattened, but the worst of the explosion seems to have gone over the dockyard. So Niobi is rocked clear of her permanent moorings. A number of her people are badly injured. A few are killed. But Niobi is generally okay. And the dockyard is, although some buildings are knocked down, is generally in good shape. But the whole north end, just on the other side of the railway tracks, is in flames. And so initially the Canadian sailors all come rushing out of Niobi and they go into the city. It's not all altruistic. A lot of them had families there. I mean, it's a horrible story. A lot of them had families in the flaming buildings, but they did absolutely heroic work, and they were immediately joined. You remember that you saw those two big British escort vessels in the harbor. They sent hundreds of men ashore who worked with Canadians, doing absolutely incredible first response work. And while they were doing that, the Army brings in by harborcraft hundreds and hundreds of troops from the outer forts and bring them down into the dockyard and into downtown Halifax, also to do emergency response. And here is the dockyard. Interesting story here. Parked alongside is the ship, the Old Colony. The Old Colony was a U.S. passenger ship which is taken up by the U.S. Navy for naval service, and the British asked to use her. So she was being sent to Britain, but her engines weren't too strong, so she put into Halifax for repairs. And she was actually sitting off the Dartmouth shore on the day of the explosion. But the medical crews from one of the British warships, and as soon as the explosion happens, there's actually two U.S. warships about 50 kilometers off of Halifax. They feel the explosion and they see the plume of cloud, and they come rushing in, and they send in their medical personnel too. So the U.S. Navy medical personnel, some of the personnel, the U.S. crew on the Old Colony, and the British medical crew bring Old Colony right over to the dockyard, and she becomes a floating hospital to bring injured right out of the north end of the city. This is just one example of how quick and innovative the Army and the Navy were. This is Niobi right after the explosion. She had 4 funnels. Three of them were knocked over. Partially, you can see an emergency funnel is there and one funnel, and you can see all of her the deck houses there reduced to a total shambles. Here's the Wellington Barracks near the dockyard. Beautiful mid 19th century brick buildings. Here's another shot, completely burned out, though they were restored, and they are still one of the major barracks for the training center for the Canadian Navy on the East Coast to this day. I mentioned the municipal government was superb. Henry Caldwell, who was a men's clothier, was deputy mayor. The mayor was actually off campaigning for the December 1917 federal election, so the deputy mayor stepped in. He raced up to City Hall, brought in all of the notables, and within hours established the Halifax Relief Committee. They brought in Robert McIlrath, who's there in the center as the head. He was a former mayor and noticed for being, although a pretty brusque with some rough edges, he was known to be one of the most efficient and effective administrators in the city. They did an absolutely brilliant job. They organized themselves into a medical committee. Well, if you look at the top, you see there's McKelvey Bell, Colonel Bell. He served with the Citizens Committee, integral with them on the medical services. But they had Transportation Committee, Fuel Committee, Food Committee. It was wonderfully efficient. And the other important aspect of the first response that Joe Scanlon did a brilliant job in researching was the role of the railways. And here you see the colored lines. These are the railways in Nova Scotia, all of which wind up in Halifax. And the railway yard in the north end of the city, as you can see here, was virtually destroyed. But the railways were able to begin to get trains through fairly soon. At least as important, the railway telegraph system was extremely efficient. And although in downtown Halifax it was blown out, just a few miles outside of the city, the lines were still standing. So this is why word of the explosion gets out so quickly and so fully. It's because of the railway telegraph lines. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the great services of the railways and the excellent communications is they enable all of the towns in Nova Scotia to immediately, like literally within an hour, to begin to bring together their doctors and nurses, to send them into Halifax and to bring injured out to go into hospitals in those cities. And as I mentioned, as Ken mentioned, my great-grandfather, Dr. John Bell, was one of the physicians from New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, about 100 miles from the city, who was brought in as a first responder. One thing that really saved the rail transportation and the shipping capacity of the port was Halifax was redeveloping its waterfront. And you can see the main old rail facilities are in the north end there on the left-hand side of the picture, which was devastated by the explosion. But the city was, but the federal government was building a new set of railway lines through the south end. And you can see those sort of lightly sketched in piers. That's the new big railway yards. And in fact, still the main railway yards in container port today. And so the trains could be just routed around the city. I'll show you a picture later. A lot of the railway is actually in a deep, deep trench dug about 50 feet down into the Halifax granite. And so it was quite safe. And this is absolutely crucial, not only getting emergency supplies in, but to enabling Halifax to return to service as a convoy port within about 5 days of the explosion. Here are shots of the after the initial emergency. The soldiers and sailors come in for the horrible job, and some of them were traumatized by it, of trying to dig through the charred ruins to find human remains and help the first investigation to identify them. This shot is terribly evocative. It looked like it could have been taken yesterday. These are the troops going through the burned out wreckage looking for charred bones. As I say, some of the troops were quite traumatized. As I mentioned, there's heroic response from the central part of the country and from the United States. The Canadian military spun into action and did superb work. They converted buildings into emergency hospitals for the Americans, especially. And here is the Americans, I believe, from Massachusetts. A wonderful response. Over 100 doctors and over 100 nurses. And the Canadian Army engineers converted the old Army headquarters building into a hospital. Here's a shot inside of one of the converted hospitals. Here's again the incredible medical services and the emergency built hospitals together with the established hospitals. The Shabukto School is turned into an emergency mortuary, a tragic picture. And just some shots for interest. I'm an old Haligonian. I got down onto the waterfront a few years ago, and I took this picture. This is what the waterfront looks like with modern housing near where the explosion would have taken place in 1917. That's the Mackay Bridge off to the north of the explosion site on the right-hand side of the picture. Here's a shot down from the Mackay Bridge back, and we're looking south down into the main port. And the explosion would have taken place right between the Mackay and the McDonald Bridge. Here's old Halifax South, where I grew up. As I said, it wasn't flattened by the explosion. Here's some of the classic pre-World War I houses, the famous brightly colored wooden houses of 19th century Halifax, which still characterize the gorgeous South End. Here's the slightly less gorgeous, more utilitarian row housing from the pre-First World War era. And here's a shot, a true Haligonian shot. Only a Haligonian could love it. This is the railway cut down to the modern container terminal. This is the railway cut blasted after 1912, blasted 50 feet down into the Halifax bedrock. The Yonge Avenue Bridge is the concrete bridge there, and beyond it, of course, is the modern container pier. But these are the protected railway tracks that were so crucial to saving Halifax and getting it in operation again. I believe I took this in the fall. Only a true Haligonian would visit the city in the fall and do a long walk in the chill Atlantic air and look at that spectacular sky. And the treat when you walk out over the railway is you get into Point Pleasant Park and you look out in the most gorgeous harbor view in the world, in my humble and unprejudiced opinion. That's looking out McNabb's Island past Mars Beach. Mont-Blanc would have been held just beyond that lighthouse on the night before she came in and blew up the city. So that's a somewhat academic but also personal view of the Halifax explosion.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. That was really fascinating. I love the talk, and I learned so much. And I've got a whole bunch of questions myself, and there's a few questions coming in too. One thing that sort of struck me that you mentioned, that you said that the people thought the Canadian Navy was useless after the explosion. Why did they think that?
Yes, I didn't have the time to go into this. Remember, Halifax had always been a Royal Navy town, and the Royal Navy only left in 1904 and 1905. And when the Royal Navy returns in 1914, Haligonians said, the real Navy is back. And they had always regarded the Canadian Navy as really clowns. They weren't professional. They weren't the real Navy. But the serious point of it was that when war broke out, under British Empire laws, the Canadian Navy, small as it was, took legal responsibility for the control of the port of Halifax. And the traffic control was done by the chief examining officer. And he was substantively in the Canadian Navy, but our Navy had to draw mostly on experienced British people. And the guy who actually filled the role was a commander from the Royal Naval Reserve. He was an expert merchant marine captain, Wyatt, his name was, who'd come out for active service in 1914. And he had come and helped get the Niobi to sea because we didn't have enough Canadian crew to get her to sea. And he was so good that he was invited to become the traffic control officer. So he's British, but he's in a Canadian billet. And when the explosion takes place, everybody blames the collision on his inefficiency. And in fact, the municipal government gangs up on him and has, no, I shouldn't say the municipal government, but the outcry from the city is so strong that the police take him into custody and he's charged with murder. No, immediately he's cleared of those charges. But the Canadian Navy fires him. There's been quite a bit of quite recent literature, and now that the secret files are open, that said, in fact, he was the scapegoat. He is the one who carried the can. In fact, what was going on at Halifax was beyond his powers, and there were actually problems in the civilian administration of the port through the pilot service. The expert pilots went on the ships. The pilot service, and it was the pilots who actually directed the ships, they were virtually their own corporation. And interestingly, even while the government is firing Wyatt, they quietly set up a royal commission on the pilot service to correct problems in the pilot services at all Canadian ports. But I've already gone too long about it. But it's a fascinating story. And as I say, interesting, it's just come to light in the last 15, 20 years.
Well, you actually led into another question. Did they not have pilots? Like, were there not pilots to guide the ships and to avoid a collision like this?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is another terrible story of scapegoating. Both ships had very experienced captains, and they had very experienced pilots with absolutely sterling records. And the larger issue was that the pilots were bringing ships in and out of port without reporting the movements to the Navy. And this was particularly the case with the Emo. She came out early in the morning, and her pilot did not report that she was sailing to the naval authorities. And so the main Navy headquarters down in the dockyard wasn't aware that so much traffic was coming out of Bedford Basin, even as this munition ship was coming in. So this was one problem. The pilots were not working effectively with the Navy. And well, the really sad story in this is Commander Wyatt, in his defense, said he had complained about the pilots not cooperating with the Navy on several occasions. And the senior officer said, oh, no, he had sent no complaints, and that was it. And he was ignored. And then later, as they were cleaning up the wreck of Niobi, they came across the letters that he had sent, copies of the letters he had sent to Ottawa, warning about the problems of the pilotage service. But the government did nothing to correct the action that had been taken against him. This is no indictment of the pilots themselves. This was the pilot administration, which was essentially being run by the local members of Parliament. And so the Navy found themselves utterly without influence over the pilots.
That seems kind of unusual that the Navy allows pilots to act separately.
Yes, and well, in fact, it looks like when Wyatt complained about the pilots and went up the chain, it was understood in Ottawa that the pilots were, all of this was done as a patronage issue under the Maritimes MPs, and that no one should squawk and make a problem. I'm projecting just a little bit there, but that's the implication of the documents that have been released in the last 20 years.
Another question came in. It says, thanks for the great presentation. And I had heard that members of the Manhattan Project who developed the atomic bomb came to Halifax during the Second World War to see the blast impact radius. Do you know if that's true or not?
I wondered about that, and Joe Scanlon gave me a lead, and I went into actually the stuff is online now, scientific studies for by the Manhattan Project, which was developing the bomb. And sure enough, one of the big explosions they investigated to see what happens when over 1,000 tons of TNT goes up was the Halifax explosion. So that is true. I don't know that they actually came to Halifax, but definitely the Halifax explosion is referenced in the research records of the Manhattan Project.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question: how many years did it take to actually rebuild Halifax, and did they follow the same street plans of the original city?
It's an inspiring story. There's lightning speed in rebuilding Halifax. And in part, that's because it has extraordinary help from Massachusetts. Massachusetts was incredible. And they sent in masses of money. They sent in all sorts of experts. But most famously, there's excellent temporary housing built very quickly. And in fact, it's a huge improvement. One of the shocking stories, and it's not in the book, it's actually... It's a later follow-on of the explosion, but the Naval Museum in the dockyard put on a display a few years ago. Fascinating. They discovered when they were renovating the old Admiralty House in the dockyard, which goes back to the 1815, they discovered up in the attic there are still burned out timbers from the explosion. But they discovered that Admiralty House had been used by the Massachusetts Medical Commission to set up a long-term health care facility in Halifax because they were so horrified at the general health of the North End that they set up a special, it was almost like it was third world. They set up a special Massachusetts Health Commission to help with public health in northern Halifax. So not only was it rebuilt, but it was built back better. I'm sorry to borrow a phrase. This was one time where the Americans were actually able to quickly, without any political nonsense, build back better, and they did. The most famous part of the story, though, is the hydrostone buildings, and that is with both federal government, mainly federal government money. The federal government actually, for all that it helped, or it sort of closed one eye when there was local scapegoating, the federal government did put in massive financial assistance through the Halifax Relief Commission, which was a federal agency that operated right down to the 1970s, paying pensions and doing all sorts of good work. But one of the early projects was the hydrostone project. So I think they generally followed the lines of the old streets, but they built a completely new blocks of buildings using this new form of building material, which was building blocks made out of high-stress concrete called hydrostone. And those were built sort of as almost assisted housing in the North End. And I know when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, the North End was still very, very, very rough. But now these have become absolutely creme de la creme, downtown shishi, high-class renovated urban living. I was surprised. Matter of fact, when I took those pictures of the North End of Halifax, I walked around the North End and I couldn't believe it. This wasn't the North End I'd known when I was a kid, but it was very rough indeed.
Oh, thanks. You talked a lot about the defense and the guns around Halifax. Was the port ever attacked during the First World War?
No, it wasn't. But it was. There's a bit of a story, a confession. There's a whole chapter of my PhD thesis on this, and I'll bore you to tears with it. No, the theory was for defending ports. It was Halifax was always so heavily fortified because it was a Royal Navy dockyard, and Royal Navy doctrine developed right from back in the 18th century is the dumbest thing you can do with your Navy is tie it down to protect your own ports. You're going to be defeated. You'll park your Navy right off of Portsmouth in England, and all your trade will be shut down, and you'll starve to death. So British doctrine, as a matter of fact, any maritime power, the doctrine is the ports should be able to defend themselves. And so Halifax was always fortified, and up with the latest guns. And when the British left the Navy left in 1904 and then the British Army left in 1906. But the reason the British asked Canada to fully maintain everything was because the British realized that it was an economy measure on the British part, but they were building new ships which were faster and that they could base cheaply in England, but these ships were so fast and long range, in an emergency, they could be deployed from England back out to crisis areas. And this became Halifax's role. It was sort of a naval station in waiting for a crisis. And it was perfect preparation for the First World War. When the First World War breaks out, everything in Halifax is ready, and the Brits come sailing in. And the matter of fact, the Canadian Army said, much like you did, they said, well, there were actually at the outbreak of war, there's quite a few scares because the Germans had fast cruisers out in the Western Atlantic, and a lot of fast German ships, which were equipped to take on armament in wartime, had taken refuge in. Remember, the U.S. was neutral. They took refuge in U.S. ports. So there are about 30 or 40 ships in U.S. ports sitting there, all crewed up, steamed up, that could have gone to sea at any time. Matter of fact, 2 of them did. And so, there was a threat, but as that threat eased off, as the British got full control of the seas, the Canadian Army said, God, why are we having all these guys hanging around? And the Royal Navy commander at Halifax just freaked. And he said, the weather in this part of the world is terrible. There is no way we can afford ships to maintain patrols off in Nova Scotia. They're supposed to be off on the main trade routes doing their jobs. And the weather is so terrible in your godforsaken country that a surprise attack is eminently likely. And so it came right down from the Admiralty, do not reduce the Halifax garrison. So it's fully maintained right to the end of the war. And the same thing happens in the Second World War. And in fact, plans are in place and fortifications are still maintained right down till when I was a kid in the 50s. So that's sorry, a long answer to a simple question, but it was never attacked. But that wasn't the reason for all of these fortifications. It was to make sure the port was secure, so the Navy could freely operate in the Central Ocean.
Oh, wow. Another question came in. It says, I understand that a lot of civilian injuries were due to flying glass from the shattered windows. Is that true?
Yes, and I don't have the exact statistics here. Yeah, the awful thing was it was wintertime, and so people didn't, well, some people rushed outside and were very badly injured as a result, but also a lot of people went rushing to their upstairs windows to see the burning ship in harbor. And the true tragedy was the number of eye injuries. And I'm sorry, I don't have the figures right here, but I remember seeing that there's something over, there's the order of 200 plus people who lose one or both eyes. And the number of people who lose both eyes and are blinded, from that one day in Halifax, it was a larger number than all of the combat casualties in the Canadian Corps through the whole of the First World War. There are larger people who suffered total blindness in Halifax in that one instant than did in the whole of the Canadian Corps in over 3 years of fighting on the Western Front.
Wow.
Oh, it's a terrible. As a matter of fact, one of the stories, actually, my great-grandfather died before I was born, but one of the stories told about him is that he was traumatized because he had to remove several eyes, and that he was just horrified by it.
I can understand that. Another question along that same line sort of is, how did the city cope with all of the dead? You showed a picture of the morgue, but there's a lot of dead to cope with. What did they do?
Oh, it's a sad story. Essentially the engineers, the military engineers, got dynamite, and in one of the big cemeteries in the north end of the city, they actually used the dynamite to blow into the ground in order to create mass graves. And related to that, it's so Canadian, is General Benson got into terrible trouble after his heroic effort to save the city. He got into desperate trouble. And that is, he did what no responsible government servant should do. And that is, he said, we've got to save the city. And where he got into horrible trouble was in the emergency reconstruction. There was virtually no building in the city that wasn't badly damaged for winter conditions. So even in the South End, doors had to be replaced, windows had to be replaced, 1,000 things, roofs shored up. And Benson did what no effective civil servant ever does, is he said, do the job. And he did the job. And he got fired as a result, because the business in Eastern Canada, he got together with some of the big construction ministries of the government, primarily railways and canals, and they had agreed to put a cap on wages for labor in Eastern Canada. And the cap, in fact, didn't work very well. And Benson told his engineers, ignore the cap, pay whatever the going market rate is for workers, to get the workers you need to protect these buildings. And he did. And within 2 weeks, he was fired for defying the authority of the government. And they brought in as his successor, Major General Lassard, who was thought to be a more political general. And they sent him down saying, you can straighten out this mess and this disobedience of civil authority. And Lassard wrote back, and it's actually Joe Scanlon found this, and we printed the whole thing in the book, sent back a blistering telegram saying, you guys are smoking something strange. You have no idea of the reality down here. People are dying. And he barreled right ahead and authorized the paying of full market rates. Benson was forcibly retired. And he went out to Victoria, BC, and he died just a couple of years after the war. And his obituary said that among his last words were expressing his despair for the people of Halifax, which is really very, very, very touching.
Yeah, that's an amazing story.
Isn't it? It's beautiful. I couldn't believe it. Joe had pieced together the story, but he didn't know. I unfortunately worked for the government for 23 years, and it's scattered through all sorts of files, and Joe didn't quite put it together. And so I went back through all the files. It's interesting for the academics here. Thank God there was digital photography, and I couldn't get up to Ottawa, and I hired a brilliant grad student who went in, and she took 6,000 images for me of all of these files that I thought Joe had used. And so I got these just before the pandemic shut down all the archives, thank God. So I was able to piece together the whole track record. And the story that came together was even worse than the one that Joe Scanlon had told. Sorry, I'm getting into professional matters here, but that's the truth. Benson is a hero.
Yeah, it sounds like it. But two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. One is just a Guelph connection. Did Admiral Kingsmill show up at the harbor to see how things were going?
Yes, it's a heartbreaking story. It looks like he wasn't too effective because his son was in the Royal Naval College, which was right in the dockyard and was quite badly damaged, and several of the cadets were quite badly injured. And my old colleague and buddy, Major John Armstrong, who did some of the research on this for me when I was at the D&D history section. He discovered that Kingsmill had in fact rushed down to Halifax, and very little from him. It looks like he was traumatized. He really was traumatized, but he rushed down to Halifax to make sure his son was okay, which actually isn't, strictly speaking, that isn't on. But John came back and said he thought a lot better of Kingsmill for having done that. And matter of fact, Kingsmill, it wasn't just his own son. He was in a blind panic about the cadets, and he was just heartsick that some of them had been quite badly injured.
Oh, okay. Well, that's really interesting. And I know Kingsmill's son did command a ship in the Second World War too.
Yeah, I believe so. Yes.
Yeah. And my last question is the book available? Can we buy it now?
Yes. Yeah. Probably I put up on a slide that the address to get it through the Laurier University Press, but they actually say it's probably wisest, not wisest, but you can also get it through Amazon.ca or Indigo.ca. Just look for Scanlon Catastrophe, and it's I think it's only about $29 or $30, which is considering that Joe put over 10 years into it.
Wow. Well, I'm going to wrap it up there, and I want to thank you, Roger. That was a really amazing talk, and your knowledge on the subject is phenomenal. I'm really impressed with how much you know, and we can't stump you at all in any of the questions, so that's great. Thank you again. And I just want to let people know that we will be having another lecture next month on February 17th, and our speaker is John Nelson Ricard, who's going to talk on Lieutenant General Andrew McNaughton on the politics of command, which I think will be a fascinating talk. And just to let everyone know that at the moment the museum is closed to the public. We are hoping to reopen on the 31st, but we are still busy behind the scenes doing lots of research and answering research questions and hosting virtual events like this. And I want to let people know that next Friday on January 28th, as part of our Fourth Friday concerts and to celebrate Robbie Burns Day, we will have McTalla Road performing at 7 o'clock on the 28th. So check that out. And there's more information on that on the Guelph Museum's website. So thank everyone for joining us tonight. And thank you again, Roger. It was a really enjoyable talk.
A privilege to be here.
And hope we have you back for a fourth talk sometime.
I certainly hope so.